Hi friends, welcome back to another video. In today's video, I wanted to share with you all some of my favourite cozy fantasy book recommendations because it's one of my favourite subgenres of fantasy. I feel like this time of year, sometimes you really want to dive into the epic fantasies, but there are also those moments where you just want to read something a bit more slower paced. You want to be able to be immersed in a fantasy setting, but with really sweet character interactions and nothing too heavy. And I think when you're in that particular mood, cozy fantasy is the perfect subgenre to really be able to immerse yourself in a new setting and feel really comfortable and cozy. If you don't know already, cozy fantasy tends to focus less so on epic quests and battles and fights, but it's usually instead set in a smaller rural setting in a small town or village, and it more often than not features a cast of characters who tend to be a little burnt out, who want a change of environment, who are in need of different jobs. The stakes tend to be much lower, and it's usually set in a really comforting environment like a bookshop or a cafe. And so it's usually more slower paced, and you focus a lot more on character relationships as opposed to a specific or a really detailed plot line. I thought it would be really fun to integrate a challenge, or no, I should say a tag that I came across a couple of months ago. So I believe this is the Cozy Fantasy book tag, and I'll make sure to link below all the details of, I think, the original creator who created this tag. But essentially it runs through some really good fantasy books, some that are on my TBR, some that weren't so good, and I just thought it would be great to incorporate all these questions to give you a more holistic overview of book recommendations. I have with me my Kiki mug, and if you have your own cup of tea or coffee or hot beverage, I hope you'll enjoy it with me as we start the video. So the first question is, what's your first ever cozy fantasy book that you've read? And I think for me it's Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater. This is a book that I have talked a lot about on my channel so far because it's genuinely like my favourite cozy fantasy book ever. This book made me fall in love with the genre, and it follows a girl called Dora who has had half a soul taken away by a fairy. Being left with only half a soul has meant that she has no embarrassment. She has no fear of embarrassment, I should say. And so she is often considered a little bit strange and odd by everybody around her. Dora accompanies her cousin for the London season in London, and it's set in Regency, England, so you can imagine how atmospheric and romantic everything is. She ends up bumping into Elias Wilder, who is the Lord Sorcier and acts sort of as like the sorcerer to the king, and she ends up getting tangled into fairy affairs. Like I mentioned, it involves the Fae, and the Fae in here aren't as dark as a lot of Fae are traditionally depicted to be in fairy tales. The atmosphere is incredible, and the way that Olivia Atwater presents a relationship between Elias and Dora herself makes it just a really, really cozy and beautiful read. Compared to the other books I'll be mentioning, this book has slightly higher stakes because there's a sort of cozy mystery going on in the background, but I think because its book is overall quite light-hearted and very magical, it fits right into the cozy fantasy genre. Question number 2 is, name a book that isn't marketed as cozy fantasy but feels like it. And I actually have 2 different books for this particular prompt, but the first one is, let me go get the book. The first one is Garlic and the Vampire by Bree Paulson. This is one of the best graphic novels I've ever read, and I don't believe it's marketed specifically as cozy fantasy, but I think it fits perfectly. But it follows our main character Garlic, who is really timid and shy until one day these vegetables in this farm, they hear that there is a vampire that settled in nearby, and so obviously they're very concerned and worried about it, and they all sort of essentially force Garlic to go and chase this vampire down. Garlic has no desire to live an adventurous lifestyle, and she just wants to tend to her own little vegetable garden. But when it becomes more and more obvious that she's sort of the only candidate to actually confront the vampire, Garlic ends up having to overcome her own insecurities. It has all the ingredients for the perfect cozy fantasy book. It follows a cast of characters in an autumnal forest, so you've got the cozy environment, you've got really cute relationships and friendships, and the stakes are pretty low, so it's such an enjoyable read as well. Another book that isn't really marketed as cozy fantasy because it has a lot of darker elements throughout it is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. I feel like T. Kingfisher does fantasy incredibly well. Her stories are so fantastical in like the most fairy tale sort of creepy and eerie way possible. It follows a woman called Mara, and Mara has seen 3 of her sisters be abused by this awful prince, and she realizes that no one can do anything about it and unless she goes out and does something about it herself. And so she ends up seeking the help of a grave witch who offers her 3 different tasks, and if she completes these 3 tasks she'll be able to overcome this awful prince. The cast of characters is really odd, but they're also really endearing. We follow a demon-possessed chicken, the grave witch herself, who is really grumpy. You follow a very quiet knight who's quite mysterious as well. Who else? Oh yes, an unconventional fairy godmother as well as a skeleton dog. Nettle and Bone is obviously filled with darker elements, and it isn't necessarily light-hearted. Well, it's not at all, but because the story development is quite slow and it progresses rather slowly, it creates a sort of sluggish and sleepy environment that really is in tune with the slow-paced fantasy, cozy fantasy subgenre. The next question is a really fun one, and it's what's a fantasy setting in which you'd be comfortable to live in? And I couldn't think of anything else at first but Hogwarts. This is my Mina Lima copy of the book, and it's honestly so stunning. I've still got all the tissue paper inside it because I don't want it to be ruined. Fantasy books were the books that really got me into reading as a child, and they've been my favourite genre ever since. And the very first one, of course, was Harry Potter. That started it all off. Hogwarts is obviously not the safest environment. It's actually very dangerous, but I think the way that the fireplace will be roaring, there'll be magical books in huge libraries, studying with all of my fellow classmates and being sorted into a house. That to me is like the ideal fantasy setting that I would be comfortable living in. But I think sort of more appropriate for cozy fantasy is actually Dalagut Dream Department Store by B.A. Lee. Now this book is a magical realism book, and the reason why I've put it in this question is because the dream-like setting of it is something that I would love to be able to live in. The whole premise of this book is that when you dream, you actually visit a mysterious town that exists in like the subconscious realm of our minds, and we would visit it each night to find a store, a department store that sells all kinds of dreams that you would then dream that night. You follow Penny, who has been recently hired to work at the Dalagut Dream Department Store, and you follow her as she discovers what each floor sells, what kind of dreams each floor sells, and she meets the really flamboyant and sort of quirky different dream makers as well. I would love to visit this town in my head that sells dreams each night. That sounds incredible, and I think it's a lovely cozy read as well. Question number 4 is name a cozy fantasy book that's on your TBR and the perfect treat to go along with it. I actually have 3 that I wanted to include because I couldn't choose between the 3 of them. But the first is called The Teller of Small Fortunes, and it's by Judy Leong. Like the title suggests, I believe this book follows a young woman who has the ability to read fortunes. She's realised that telling big fortunes can often cause some sort of unrest and trouble, so she's resorted to telling only smaller fortunes. She's comfortable with the way that she's living until she's sort of approached by an ex-mercenary and a semi-reformed thief or something, and they basically ask her to help them to find a lost child. So on there unfolds some sort of cozy mystery, I believe. It's supposed to involve a really cozy cast of different people like bakers. There's a magical cat involved as well, so I'm really looking forward to this book, and of course the treat to go along with it would be a lovely fortune cookie. Another book I want to pick up is A Witch's Guide to Magical Innkeeping by Sangu Mandana. Now, I've read The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by her, and it was really cozy, and I know so many people have been recommending that for this genre, but I'm really looking forward to this one, and I think this one is being published in 2025, so next year hopefully I'll be able to read this one. I think Sangu Mandana said this book isn't necessarily a sequel or a companion novel to the first, but it has the same sort of cottagecore witchy vibes. It's supposed to follow a witch called Sarah, who was one of the most powerful witches living in Britain until she ends up being kicked out of the magical guild somehow. And so she ends up having to help her Aunt Jasmine run an inn in Lancashire, and she does so rather grumpily, I think. That is until one day she comes across this magical book that tells of being able to restore lost powers. And so she goes to this historian called Luke, who is very cold and icy and distant, but he might be the only one to help her solve the mystery behind it. I think this is going to be such a cozy book. It's supposed to involve a talking fox and I think it's going to have really sweet romance as well. It's in Lancashire, so hopefully there'll be lots of gorgeous nature descriptions as well, and I think it will go really lovely with a Lancashire, what's it called? Butter pie, I think. I've never tried a Lancashire butter pie before, but I'm assuming it's really delicious and also perhaps one of the things that they serve up at the inn. Thirdly, I have Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. I know a lot of other people have recommended this book on their cozy fantasy recommendations list, and so it's made me all the more eager to start reading it, but I bought this back in July for my birthday and I still haven't actually finished it. I did make a start and I was really enjoying it, and I know that Tress, our main character, has an obsession with mugs, so maybe the perfect treat to go along with it would be like a sweet mug cake of some sort. Brandon Sanderson was, I believe, very much inspired by The Princess Bride as he wrote this book, but we follow a girl called Tress who has only ever lived and stayed on this little island her whole life. But one day when her best friend Charlie is whisked away by his father to go and find a bride, and he ends up getting into a bit of trouble, Tress decides to set off on a very dangerous journey across the Emerald Sea to go and rescue him. The couple chapters that I managed to read were really comforting and warm, and even though the book follows a sort of quest-like path plot line, it isn't really like an epic fantasy at all. I know that a lot of people have been recommending it as a perfect cozy fantasy read, so I'm excited to hopefully get to this one soon. Question 5 is pick a cozy fantasy book that didn't really meet your expectations, and this is really sad because I had such high expectations for this particular book. I actually think a lot of people do recommend it, and I can see why they recommend it, but I think the quality of the writing really disappointed me. It should have been the perfect cozy fantasy book, but it's called A Fellowship of Bakers and Magic by Jay Penner. Essentially, you follow Arletta, who is a human baker in a fantasy world called Adenashire, but because because she is often competing against other magical creatures like elves and dwarves, she has to work twice as hard for her bakes to taste really yummy. So when an orc neighbour secretly enters her into the magical and very prestigious elven baking battle, Arletta faces a very big dilemma. So it's supposed to be a delightful, cozy fantasy story filled with yummy treats and baked good and magic and romance in a small magical setting. I really am gutted about this book. It even has the cutest little like illustrations of cupcakes and cakes. But the reason why it disappointed me so much was because I was a little thrown off by the quality of the writing. I thought that the dialogue was quite cringy and the writing itself perhaps wasn't as well executed as it could have been. It wasn't as refined. It reads a lot more like a fanfic. So if you know that going in and you just want a really good cozy time, then I do recommend it for the atmosphere. But yeah, just keep that in mind because I think that's one of the reasons why I was so let down by it. The second last question is there a cozy fantasy or comforting book that you feel like is underrated? And I actually have two for this. So the first one is 10,000 Stitches by Olivia Atwater. Again, this is set in the same world as Half a Soul, but the reason why I put it under this question is because I feel like it's just not talked about as much as the first novel. So many people have raved about Half a Soul, but I feel like a lot of people maybe haven't picked up 10,000 Stitches, or I just haven't seen it being talked about as much. So it's definitely one that I wish was more on the radar because it's such a sweet, cozy story. It's set in Regency England again, but we follow this time a housemaid called Effie, and Effie has really inconveniently fallen in love with the gentleman of the house, but because it's set in Regency England, it's basically taboo for a maid to marry a gentleman. So when she stumbles upon Lord Blackthorn, who is a fairy, she ends up striking a deal with him that could be good or not for her. Lord Blackthorn says he'll help her win the gentleman's heart if she just sews 10,000 stitches onto his favourite jacket. Unfortunately, Lord Blackthorn doesn't really seem to know what he's doing, and so ensues a whole lot of troubles and fun and magic. It's just as whimsical and filled with gorgeous romance as the first, and it's also got so much substance behind it. I think Olivia Atwater does such an incredible job of presenting problematic things that happen during Regency England, and she addresses them in a way that's really constructive and adds to the story plotline. I just think this book, if you've read Half a Soul and you loved it, you have to read this one if you haven't already. The other book that I wanted to mention was by Ash, Oak and Thorn by Melissa Harrison. This is a middle grade that I adore, and I just wish it was more well known amongst other people as well. This book follows three little people called Moss, Cumulus and Burnett. They wake up during spring to find that Cumulus is fading away. So they set off in search for answers across terrains and different natural environments. The book is written in a very classical way, like a lot of children's classics used to be written, and it's written so poetically and beautifully. There's a hint of fantasy in it, and the nature writing is gorgeous. So it makes it for a very cozy and comforting read, and I really wish more people would pick it up. Last but not least is a fantasy book that makes you feel really happy and full of joy and coziness. So I have here a graphic novel called Hooky. This is another one of my favourite graphic novels, and it's by Miriam Bonastrata. It's another one that's perfect for this time of year because the colour palette is very autumnal. It follows two twins called Danny and Dorian, and after a series of events they end up finding themselves on wanted posters all across the town. Noticing this, they realise that they are being chased by really powerful witches and wizards all across the kingdom. It's filled with so much adventure, so much humour, really cute romance between the different characters, and the art is actually stunning. This was initially a webtoon that later got turned into a graphic novel, and I think there are 3 books now out. I wouldn't describe it as a cozy fantasy because a lot of epic fantasy moments happen, like quests and stuff, but it leaves you feeling really cozy and comforted and just full of joy and really, really happy as well. I haven't seen too many people talk about this particular graphic novel either, so I did want to include it in this video. But that is it for today's video. In the hour or so that I've been filming, the sun has gone down and it's really dark now, as you can probably tell from the lighting. If you have any other books to recommend that aren't already on this list but you think are perfect to read, then I'd love to know what they are in the comments below. I'm always on the lookout for more of these books, so I can't wait to see what other books there are. But I'll see you all in the next video. Bye friends!